All right. Hello, hello, and welcome back to Influential Dental, where I am Julianne O'Connor here with my co host, Michael Keeter. And we have a phenomenal guest on the show today who is helping to also uplift dental professionals in the space, Dr. Kyle Stanley. We are so excited to have you on the show. Can't wait to have a candid conversation with you that gives our listeners some insights into what's happening in the industry and who you are and what you're all about, because you have a tremendous amount of influence. And we know it's in an area that matters a lot right now. So welcome to the show. I want to give a little background on you. And I know Michael has a bunch more probably, but then I want to turn it to you and just, you can maybe share a few things that you're working on that maybe we don't know about. So obviously, if somebody visits your site, we know you're a tech genius. You've been working in the AI space. You've been named top 100 doctors in the world. You've been given all sorts of, accolades, if you will. But tell us a little bit more about your background and how did you end up a researcher and all this good stuff?
Yeah, I've had a fairly interesting experience in dentistry in the sense that I've had my hand in many different areas of dentistry. I started doing research when I was in dental school, so that led to a speaking career. I have a private practice that I'm not practicing anymore, but I started a fairly large dental AI company called Pearl. I'm now doing a lot in the advising space, so advising tech companies, investing in tech companies, working with funds for investing in other tech companies. So I've had this very interesting career where I've been involved with laboratories. I mean, so many different aspects of dentistry. And I think what that helps me do is bring this comprehensive global vision of where dentistry was, where it's going, and hopefully how it's changing for the positive. A big part of what I do now is helping other doctors with mental and relational health. So that's been a big focus of mine for the
I love
last few
that. And,
years now
I'm going
too.
to want to dive into that today. And Michael will warn you that, I love the topic around psychology and what's going on in this industry specifically, but certainly even outside of this industry. And your impact has already resonated with so many people in that area. And so you come with all this technical background, and yet where it seems like you're having this massive impact and probably saving a lot of lives, to be really frank, is in the mental health space. But before I jump into that and deep dive, Michael, tell us a little bit about your connection to Dr. Stanley. I'm kind of
Yeah,
curious
so
about
I've
your
known
background.
Dr. Stanley for many years now. When I was with Noble Biocare, a lot of people probably know I was with that company for about 16 years and loved it and created a lot of good relationships. And that's when I first met Dr. Stanley, probably, gosh, maybe upwards of 12 years ago now, when he was a practicing dentist, was also a KOL for that company, or Noble Biocare, and I'm sure still does some work with them. But I got to work with him a lot of various capacities and got to see him kind of behind the scenes. We've gone up to dinner a few different times, seen him at some different conferences. And what I've always appreciated about Dr. Stanley is what you see is what you get. And when you see him on Instagram and other things, I mean, he's a family man. He has fun. Some other pros I've noticed, he obviously went to USC. He was in a rock band, which throw out a name, Atreyu, to those folks. I know you're still friends with them, and I would love to see a shred one of the.
So yeah, I still play music more just for fun. I make music for my
Nice.
kids a lot. So yeah, every once in a while with Atreyu and they're back in town, I get up on stage and do a song here or
Wow.
there.
So
So will
talented.
people see you in Anaheim
It's
then
fun.
on Friday? Then are you going to jump up on stage?
They will see me. I don't know if they'll see me on
Okay.
stage. It's always last minute. It's always like,
Right.
hey Kyle, we're gonna play this song, and do you want to play the bass part at the end because I want to get
No,
up
So
and
that,
do you
sing or
ever do
something.
you
So
ever question if you
every
missed
once
your
in a while.
calling and you wish you would still be out there on stage? Or
Well,
okay.
I am still on stage. That's the thing. It's like, I grew up on stage. I was a professional dancer from the
Oh
time I
wow.
was 8 to 18. I was an actor, so I was always on stage. And so I think speaking and kind of having influence, let's say,
Yeah.
fit in well for me because I
Okay,
was
so you and I
comfortable
have
on
that in
stage.
common. So I have the acting background, did the whole show choir dancing thing as well. But I'm
Hmm.
curious because I didn't take a technical, stance, because I was just like get to LA and dive in and have fun, and there was no time for school. So how did you manage to become a
Yeah.
dentist at the same time if you had that artist passion?
Yeah. I mean, I've always been an artist for sure. Yeah. I wanted to be an artist as a kid. When people asked me, I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be a cartoonist. I loved drawing and painting, and then I got into music, and I wanted to be a musician, and I love dancing, and I was also really passionate about
Yeah.
science. So I was said, well, let me check out science. And I originally thought that I was going to be a plastic surgeon. I wanted to use science and art together in that. And then I got really interested in surgery. I ended up interning with an oral surgeon, and then I just fell in love with dentistry. And so I decided to do that. And even during dental school, I mean, I was still doing modeling, so I was still
Yeah.
involved with the arts. I was still playing music in
Wow.
dental school,
So
And
and
he's
our
wait,
so
hold on. You
it's
think
always
he
been a
has
part
great
of me
hair
for
now?
sure.
You should see some of his modeling during college at USC. I've seen some of those pictures, locks and locks of the rocker hair. So, Dr. Kyle Stanley
Yeah,
has some great hair.
I had hair down
Nice.
past my
So do
shoulder.
you have
Yeah.
representation today? That's what I want to know. I'm still represented. So
I I don't, but I actually just did a photo shoot for one of the
oh,
companies that I'm an
nice.
advisor for. They needed now I'm like the older
Yeah.
gentleman dentist, you know. I used to be like the younger guy. Now they need someone that looks like
Distinguished.
distinguished and has a
Yeah.
gray beard.
That's a
So
huge
yeah,
niche.
that's me
We
now.
always said with men, they worked more at this point in their career.
Older.
So that's
Yeah, for sure.
amazing. And if you need
Hmm.
representation, I've got a good agent
Hmm.
that introduce you to. So yeah. So then,
Nice.
I know, Mike, you're going to have tons of questions as well. So I'm not going to try and dominate this, but I am so curious what's happening in the world of mental health and wellness. And you obviously somehow came to this as a priority. I often think that we teach what we need to learn, or something that has struck us personally that leads us into wanting to help people in a certain way. Do you have a personal experience with this, or is there something that we should know that led you into wanting to help people?
Yeah, it was February 2018. It was literally a dark and stormy night. I remember that because, you know, as you know, in California, we don't have a lot of dark and stormy nights. So I came home around 7 p.m. I remember the smell of the asphalt, that wet asphalt smell. I went to my front door, tried to open the door, and the door was locked. And my wife had the deadbolt on. So I knock on the door. She opens the door, holding my son at the time, who was about 1. She said, "Welcome home." And I said, "I can't do this anymore." Now, anybody who's married, this is probably not what you want to say to your spouse, because she's like, "What are you talking about? Marriage, kids, living together. What do you mean?" And I'm like, "Oh, no, 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 no. Dentistry. I can't do
Mm-hmm.
dentistry anymore." You see, at the time, on the outside, I had everything that my 18-year-old self wanted. I was making hundreds of thousands of dollars. I was driving a nice car, living in a great area. I had a celebrity practice in Beverly Hills. I was publishing in the top journals around the world, speaking at the top podiums, AACD, AO, AAP, I mean, all the big ones. But I was having challenges. I was being threatened to be sued by a patient. I was being threatened to be sued by a team member. I had complications happening in my practice, you know, a revolving door of team. I was losing my relationships, my personal relationships, because I was focusing so much in dentistry. And I knew that I had to make change, but I didn't know what it was. And for everyone on this call, you guys fly
Mm-hmm.
a lot like I do. You know, when they say when the plane is going down, put your own oxygen mask on first, which is
Mm-hmm.
counterintuitive to what most of us think. And I realized I had been putting everyone else's oxygen mask on. I finally had to put my own oxygen mask on first. And I knew I had to go on this journey, but I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what I had to do. So I started going on this journey, and me being a researcher, I mean, this is what I do. I start researching things. So I started looking up things like positive psychology, the psychology of
Mm-hmm.
overachievers, and all these things, how to communicate better, and going through the science on this and realized there's so much science on all of this. So I spent months and months and months doing this. And then I remember I started taking a day off a week, which sounds crazy to most dentists. The ABA says only 10% of dentists take any time off. So I was taking a Friday off. I went to the post office, and I remember seeing all these people and going, "Don't you guys work? What are you doing here?" I went next door and I got an acai bowl. I did my residency in Brazil, so
Nice.
I like Brazilian culture. I'm eating an acai bowl. The California sun is shining down on my face, and I remember thinking, I'm
Mm-hmm.
finally getting better. And I had started implementing daily success habits, learning about communication, realizing what I was deficient in. And I started using that, and my life took off. I started my company Pearl, that's now valued at over
Amazing.
$400 million. Our practice took off. My speaking role took off. I started doing more research. My relationships started getting better. And so, because I had this great experience with going from burnout to thriving, I wanted to start sharing that with other dentists. And because I had a platform, from Instagram and Facebook to lecturing 40 times a year, I started speaking about it and realizing just how important it was. I would, for example, Michael would bring me out from Noble Biocare, and I'd speak for 6 hours about implants, restorative components, emergence profile, screw retained. And for 10 minutes, I would talk about mental health. And afterwards, everybody came up and talked to me about, thank you so much for saying that. I'm going through that. My wife, my husband, my daughter, my colleague, my partner. And I realized, whoa, this is something that people really need to hear. And so I put a
Yeah,
big
yeah,
focus on
it's
that.
funny.
And it's been the most rewarding thing that I've
Yeah,
ever
it's
done in
it's super
dentistry,
interesting
for
because
sure.
I remember when I would speak on burnout prevention and nobody came, and then now there's a wait list and it sells out, right?
Mhm.
But I'm curious. We're human beings, right? And so even though you're out there and doing all of this, so what happens when you sort of feel like you're up against the wall again? Like, how do you like? What's a takeaway that somebody could take right now and say, hey, I'm up against it again. I'm feeling burnt out. What's one thing somebody can do right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so many frameworks, there's so much research around this. I mean, one of the things is just being prepared for that time. So like for me, I have a framework that I call the dream sequence, which is diet, relationships, exercise, appreciation, meditation, and sleep. And so these are the daily success habits that are science backed that people can do to avoid getting into that state. But let's say you are in that point. Well, you can go backwards and look at all those things that you haven't done. How is your diet? How is your exercise? Are you focusing on relationships? Are you having appreciation for what you do have? Are you meditating? Are you sleeping? I mean, one of the big things for me was I wasn't prioritizing sleep. For me, I became a sleep Nazi. I am such a sleep Nazi now, and I say Nazi in a good way, which sounds weird. I am very regimented on my sleep now. I had orthodontic surgery
Yeah.
because of this, because I realized that
Yeah.
I had an airway problem. So that's one of the things. Another thing that I learned from my friend Martin Mendelson, and we do a podcast called Wellness and Dentistry, is living between the stimulus and the response, learning how to live in that
Mhm.
space. When I was at my lowest point, it was very much stimulus, boom, immediate response. I was so
Mhm.
reactive to patients, to team members, to my family, and being able to understand myself and really kind of have
Mhm.
self mastery has completely
Yeah,
changed my life.
so interesting because Dr. Stanley, I love everything that you're saying because so much of this is just conscious behavior and it's implementing practical psychology and things that just make a tremendous amount of sense. It's funny because I think I'm on the same journey in a lot of ways, and yet I still get burned out from time to time, and I still have to implement
Mhm.
my own things. And sometimes it's hard to muster up implementation of the very things that you need to do. You know what I mean? Like we're struggling. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting thing, but especially I think you continue to see people who they're burnt out. They know they need to do some certain things, but they are so scared to reel it in because they are dependent on their revenue streams. They've gotten themselves into a
Hmm.
hole. So how do they practically go about sort of tackling that? Do you recommend they go get help and get a coach, get somebody to jump in and show them it's not so bad? Do they need to look at it because they're not looking at it? Where do they go from here? Because
Hmm.
I
Well, I think dentists have this weird thing of thinking that soft skills are not skills. So they spent 8, 12 years learning how to prep a tooth or place an implant or do smile design or whatever, but they just think they're supposed to know how to be good at communication, and they're supposed to know how to be good at having crucial conversations. They're just supposed to know how to be a leader. I mean, it's the same thing. The people that spend time, effort, and money to get better at this are the ones that excel. I mean, I'm a great example of this. When I had burnout, I realized that I had a problem. I identified my triggers. I found my purpose in life. I learned daily habits and I elevated above that. What I just said was my
Mhm.
ripple theory. That was basically my experience of how I went through this. And that's how I teach it now. But
Yeah.
I spent time, I spent money. I got coaches. I took courses. I sat under
Yeah.
mentors. I spent time just like how every dental professional listening spends time on, oh, I want to learn guided surgery.
Mhm.
So I'm going to go take a course. I'm going to spend time on that. I'm going to put effort into it.
Yeah.
I'm going to get my
How do
team
you
rallied around it. It's the same thing. What you spend time and effort
Yeah.
on, you get
So
better
so
at.
it's interesting. So you mentioned the team here, and Michael, you're back. So I think my question, my curiosity, I always think about, we're also a product of our environment, but oftentimes in the dental space or as a high achiever or an influencer, you tend to be over or carry a persona with the team that you sort of have surrounding you, right? So, how do you elevate the
Mhm.
people around you? Because we're always talking about how do we lift other people up and why does it affect us in a way that lifts us up, right? So, how do they go about helping the people around them as well as themselves? How can you combine those two? I mean, do you have a methodology?
Well, I think leading by example is probably the first one. I mean, we saw this with our practice when I have two partners, Matt Najad and Mark Helm. And when we started really focusing on
Uh,
our fitness, we didn't go tell our team members, you guys should really start going to the gym. You guys should really start meal prepping. You guys should stop eating fast food. We never said it. But guess what happened? They started going to the gym. They started meal prepping because they saw us meal prepping and it just became part of the
mm,
culture. That is one of the first steps. The other thing would be to improve your communication. For me, that means setting expectations and having boundaries. And that was something that I was very bad at before with team, with patients, with family members. Once I got good at that, it's funny, that's what I realized I had a problem with. I was a pretty good dentist. I mean, Mike knows, he's seen my stuff. I was pretty good, right? I was okay. What I suffered with was setting expectations with patients, setting boundaries with patients, and communicating both of those boundaries and expectations. Now, I was poor at that with my team. I was poor at that with my family and in my personal life too. So it's funny, like for me, I didn't need to go learn a bunch of new clinical things. Even though I had complications, they were normal complications that everybody had. What I needed to learn was how to set expectations with patients. Yes, 98% of my implants that I placed
yeah.
integrated. But guess what? 2% didn't. And those 2% were the ones that would drive me
Right?
freaking crazy and would also drive my team crazy and the patient crazy too, right? So I had to learn how to set expectations. I had to create frameworks and sheets and communication
Yeah.
strategies in order to do that. And it totally
Would you
changed
consider
my
yourself
practice.
a perfectionist like so many people in this industry? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would. Yeah, I'm never happy just like
Yeah.
sitting where I am. And this is like this um, hedonistic adaptation that I think
Bring it.
um,
Yeah.
most humans have, right? You really want to make $50,000 and you
Oh,
make
give me
$50,000.
more.
You're like, I have to
Yeah.
make $100,000. And I mean, I know people that make
Hmm.
$100 million and they're like, no, I have to get to 1 billion. And you're like, why?
Yeah.
What do you need that for? There's something innate in humans that we're never really satisfied. But I think in dentistry, if you don't come in with that, they
Yeah.
beat that into you. And that's in dental school. They show you a prep and they say it's supposed to be point 0.3 and yours is point
Mm.
0.2. So you failed.
Yeah, it's amazing.
I mean, we're measuring in
Yeah,
microns.
Michael, I know you've got some questions for Dr. Stanley, so I don't want to dominate all of this like I've been doing, but I've got so many questions. It's so interesting.
No,
Such a
no, I see that a lot in dentistry. Me being in the field for 18 years and being in hundreds of offices, meeting thousands of dentists. Dr. Stanley, you're right on with dentists in general. I think it's okay for dentists themselves because it is a lonely profession a lot of the times, right? They're the CEO. They have to worry about the patient. They're closing cases. They're worrying about bills. They're worrying about their staff. But they do need a support staff, and a lot of them are taking it on themselves, and that's where it leads to a lot of mental strife and issues. And I think it's great that what you're doing, Julianne and others, and I guess us on this podcast, is really to have people open up. And if you need help, find it. It's okay. It's not a weakness, it's a strength, right? You have a community around you that are there at the highest levels, including yourself and others. So I guess what I would ask is that just a mind shift that some of this needs to be taught in dental schools? Because even when I was at other companies, right, it was clinical, clinical, clinical all the time. When I was, director of training education, I tried to bring in kind of what I call this fifth pillar, which we talked about mental health and things that were non-clinical. Is that something that I think in dental schools
Mhm.
or even early on in professions at DSOs and others that they really need to tackle this?
Yeah, that's right. I forgot that you allowed me to speak about mental health
I
on a
did.
webinar, which was very early on, maybe during
Yeah.
COVID or something. Um, it's challenging. So I was a professor at a university for 9 years. There's no more space, right? It's always like, yeah, we'd love to talk about this. What do you want us to remove? And there's already schools like where I taught at USC where they don't teach amalgam anymore, right? There may be schools coming soon where you don't teach analog impressions anymore. You only teach digital. It's challenging for it to be taught in dental school. I would love for it to be taught in dental school, but I think that's challenging. I think what could be taught in dental school would be the thought that
Mhm.
you need to learn this, right? We're not going to teach you this. We're here to teach you how to prep a tooth and take a tooth out and do a root canal, make a denture. But you need to focus the next 5 years out of school on learning mental resilience, learning how to communicate, learning how to be a leader,
I have
etc.
an add-on to that or a question because I just got asked to speak at a dental school, but they're asking me to speak to basically the business club, right? So whatever, 60 students who, and it's because they heard me on,
Hmm.
Mark Costas's podcast, Dr. Costas's, and
Hmm.
and so they want this topic in the community, right? And they think it's important, but they don't put a budget towards it, right? So everything that I do is supported by my partners, and so I'm able to go, and I'm thankful I'm
Yeah.
able to. But in the school system, I mean, is there something we can do as a community to help fund a scholarship that supports them having a piece of this? I mean, have you thought about that, or are you doing something with that? I'm curious.
Yeah, I've definitely thought about it and put a lot of effort into this. It is very challenging. It's like when I get taught or when I get invited to speak about mental health at universities. So I've spoken at universities about mental health for dental schools. Every single time that I've been invited, it's because there's been a
Mm.
suicide. So
Whew.
the unfortunate thing is that they're businesses, right? Universities are businesses. They realize that when a student dies, they're losing money. There's no tuition coming from that student anymore. So now they say, oh my gosh, we need to make a mental health club and we need to put effort into this, right? And this is what's happening on the DSOs too. So, like, I'll take it, right? I'll take it that now they're going to make this a priority, but where it's coming from is kind of yucky, right? It's the same thing with the DSOs. I'm implementing now wellness programs in about three different pretty large DSOs. Now, the reason usually isn't because, gosh, we really just want to help our doctors and we want them to be just well-rounded individuals. And no, why are they doing it?
Mhm.
Because there's so much
Retention.
turnover, because there's doctors that
Yeah.
are committing suicide, because people are miserable and they're leaving that DSO, because there's lawsuits and there's litigation, because people aren't sleeping and are doing, are drinking a lot or something like this. Like, they're doing it for the money. And I'm okay that they finally made it a priority because they realize that the money is coming out the bottom. It's dripping out the bottom with all the turnover and the absenteeism. But at least it's becoming a
Right.
topic of discussion. Like, I'm trying to look on the
Yeah, I
positive
mean,
side
I
of this.
agree. And, you can go in, you can approach it from the, hey, if you want to help, your hiring and your retention, then you got to have professional development. You got to show that you care about these people, et cetera, et cetera. But we ultimately know this is a corporate decision. So there's this mixed bag
Yeah,
of goods, right? Go ahead, Mike. You have a
yeah,
question?
No, but as you're saying, I mean, that is the value statement, right? It is about dollars and cents, but it's like the chicken or the egg, right? It's like, no, you need to take care of yourself first, and then you can share with your teammates, share with the rest of the organization, and so on. So again, whether it comes at the end of the sentence or at the beginning, at least they're starting to see it. But you're right, it has to equate to better overall dollars, but again, more retention, more issues, more problems. And you want to be a leader, especially DSOs or any organization, right? Or you want to be that influential person in that community. You're going to have to do things different because up until now, it hasn't been done. And now those numbers are continuing to climb. So how do we not only level those out, but then how do we, be different than anyone else? And that's what I'm trying to talk with other organizations about, not just dentists, but my own organizations as others is you can be different and it's okay to be different and you can speak about this and still get the dollars and cents and still talk clinical and still elevate dentistry and be influential in dentistry. But this is okay to deal with it from this side of it as well.
What about
Yeah, sometimes we know that humans don't move unless it
exactly?
hurts enough, right? Like there's this story, I forget where I heard it. Some guy's walking on the street and he hears this dog whimpering and he goes up to the dog owner and he goes, "Why is your dog whimpering?" He goes, "He's sitting on a nail." And he goes, "Well, why doesn't he move? Why doesn't he do something about it?" He said, "Well, it doesn't hurt enough yet." And sometimes that's how I was, right? I didn't have the awareness to even know that I was going down, down, down. So for me, it wasn't until I was at the very bottom that I had to do something. I would love to catch people on their first inkling of falling down, right? But sometimes I have to wait until they're fully ready to say, "Oh my gosh, I have to do this or else I'm going to quit. I'm going to burn out. I'm going to,
What about
do
the
something bad,"
executive
let's say.
teams? Let's think about this. So most of our executive teams, especially with these multi-billion-dollar companies, I mean, they're high-strung, high achievers, generally speaking, as well. So what do you see that is different about, let's say, an executive of, some, I don't want to use Pearl as an example, but they're right up there, right? But of one of these
Mm,
companies
yeah.
where they're thriving, they're still under a tremendous amount of pressure. But why aren't they feeling this, or are they? Are you seeing statistically why is it so different in dental?
Well, executive coaching has existed for years and years. There's no bad connotation to it. Many times these multi-billion dollar companies will provide coaches for for these highly achieving people. I think the difference is, so for me, coming from clinical practice, single owner practice like my dad's practice, then going into my practice, which is like a partnership, still a single practice, but a partnership, and then working with DSOs and then going into the startup world. What's different is that you're not doing everything. In dentistry, the challenging thing is when you're an owner doctor and you're also doing the HR, you're also writing the payroll, you're also making sure that all the OSHA standards are there. That's where the overwhelm comes from because most dentists are good at doing dentistry. And if we just had to do dentistry, we'd be great at it. I mean, that's why the DSO DPO world started because they realized, shit, dentists are good at doing dentistry, but they kind of suck at doing everything else. And it's because we were never taught that. I mean, for 8 years, we didn't learn any of that stuff. All we learned was how to prep teeth, which is a fantastic skill. But it's challenging when you're prepping teeth, you're measuring in microns, but then you're also thinking about hiring and firing, or you're also thinking about, the overhead or reducing costs or ordering. That's where the challenge comes in. And I think a lot of dentists need to realize what they're good at, where they can delegate. And I forget, one of you was mentioning I think it was you, Julianne, mentioning that maybe the money is an issue there. And I think there's a misconception that if you
Right.
delegate, you're going to lose money. But think if you delegate and that opens up time and energy for you to be more efficient in your clinical practice, that may actually grow your practice. So by paying for someone else to, let's say, do HR, that may allow you to focus more on the clinical aspect
I
and
love
it
that.
grows your practice.
Well, that's 100% true, right? Because we know chair time in a dental office is the most profitable. So, in the love of a dentist, right? Whether it's implant dentistry or crown or bridge or whatever else. So, again, you free up an hour or 2 hours of your time doing other things that are non dental. Do what you love and let the experts do what they can do, whether it's payroll, whether it's HR.
What Michael was
Yeah.
saying is totally right. It is that, the ADA said that the average chair time per hour per chair is $440. And people don't really know that. They need to think about that is your expensive time. So anything you can do outside of the chair, I would say do it. That's why I'm very big on predictable dentistry, guided surgery,
Mhm.
smile design, guided preps, anything you can do outside of the chair, do it because it's way less expensive. so that when you go into the chair, all you have to do is execute. You don't have to
Yeah.
make all the decisions. And that helps your mental health because you have less
Yeah,
decision
absolutely.
fatigue. The average adult makes 35,000
That's
decisions a
incredible.
day.
What a stat, right? If you think about it. Um, you're talking about this, and then I'm looking at, the like 1,000 projects that I have, and then having to also pay the bills and manage my household, and thinking about, oh, okay, yeah, this is why this comes up, right? I'm a huge fan of Tim
Yeah.
Ferriss when he talks about outsourcing. It's not going to be perfect. People are going to mess up. They're not you. They're not going to be, but if you
Hmm.
don't use them, you're not going to do the stuff because most of the time you don't have time.
Yep.
And I always say outsource where you drag your feet. So that's that junk that you really just don't want to touch, right? Like the stuff you really just don't want to do, because it also
Yep.
takes away so much effort and energy, just even mental energy in and of itself, right? I'm curious. So, even you right now with everything that you have going on, you're a high achiever. There's a lot on you in terms of your reputation now as an influencer, and so when you come up against these obstacles that are bound to present themselves no matter what, like what do you have a way of dealing with obstacles or your own insecurities when these things come up? Because insecurity is like huge, right? We're always constantly dealing with people who are lacking confidence. What do you do when you come up against those things now with whatever your initiatives are, personal or otherwise?
Yeah. Well, two things I've learned from my friend Martin Mendelsohn is, one is the Eisenhower matrix, which is what's important and what's, like what you need to do now, what you can do later, what's important and what's not important. This allows you to take a general look at everything on your plate. Everybody listening to this is busy, right? We have family stuff, we have personal stuff, we have health, we have our profession, we may have multiple professions like some of us. Um, it's challenging, but if you have everything accounted for and you know what I need to do now, this is what I'm going to do, or what I can delegate, or what I can do, but I can do later, that makes you feel so much more in control than just looking at everything going, oh my gosh, I have all this stuff to do. When really today, you may only have
Okay.
three things you have to do, but you have to do them today. That's definitely one of the things that has changed things for me because I've always been busy. I've never just done one thing. It's like even when I was in dental school, I was in
Yeah.
dental school, but also modeling. It's like even when I was in college, but I was in a band. It's like I never did just one thing. And even when I was a dentist, I was in dental, or I was a dentist, but I was speaking, or I was also
Yeah.
researching, or I was doing other things. So I've always had my
Yeah.
hand in multiple areas. And that's the way, at least now
Yeah.
after my burnout, that I'm not
So
getting
that
burnt
matrix,
out
I,
again.
I know it very well, but there's a corner of it that is like let the balls drop, right? It's the stuff that doesn't fit any of those three you
Mhm.
mentioned. It's the stuff that really is just not important enough. Yeah, it's stuff you could do. It's stuff that maybe you kind of should do, but not nearly doesn't make the other three. Yeah.
Not
So
right
how do
now.
you let that drop and let it go if you're not outsourcing it? I mean, sometimes things have to fall, and it's just it could be some emails and calls from some people who are asking you for something, and you're just like, man, love you, but I gotta pass. I can't even respond.
That's a very challenging one for me, but it comes down to my main three things that I realized I was bad at, which was again, setting expectations, having boundaries, and communicating those expectations and boundaries. Having boundaries was a big challenge for me. I am a people pleaser. I want to be liked. If someone asks me for something, I want to do it. If someone asks me to be on a podcast, I want to do it. But guess what? There's times when there's too many invitations. I mean, this happens with the speaking world. You know this too. I see you speak all over the place. It's like I could speak twice a week, but
Yeah.
I probably wouldn't be married. I probably wouldn't be a very good dad. So I have to have these boundaries, and I've gotten very good at this. Actually, it's something that I do Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and it's one of the things that they teach you with how to have boundaries with someone. When someone's coming towards you,
Yeah.
stop them right there and say, hey,
Yeah.
stand back right now, don't come closer to me. And just like having verbal
Hey.
boundaries. It's funny, they teach kids in jiu-jitsu that, or they teach the parents
Yeah.
kind of that teaches the kids, kids won't have verbal boundaries unless they feel like they can
Oh,
back it up physically.
interesting.
And I think some of that is the same in business, is like you won't have verbal boundaries unless you can
Wow. Yeah,
emotionally back
that's
it up.
profound. So we were just talking about this earlier. Mike and I today we were on with the founders of American Dental Institute who present this podcast, and one of them I think was, and they're Brazilian as well. So everything they're going to resonate with all of this.
Yeah.
But and I think
I'm going to be
wasn't
in
Dr.
Brazil in 2
Tellis
weeks.
doing jujitsu? And now Mike's gone again, but
Yeah.
I think he hurt himself actually doing some jujitsu today. I was
Oh,
in
really?
recovery
Yeah.
mode. But interesting. I had
Yeah.
never
Common
heard
injuries.
that about backing it up, and I've done some interesting stuff in the line of work on how not to trigger people and some different things with respect to being
Hmm.
able to hold your own and say back off. Like really give somebody that place,
Hmm.
but how do you do it in a way that doesn't cause some sort of other backfire, I guess, at the end of the day.
Lose the relationship. I was very scared. For me, a big thing of setting boundaries for me was in the speaking world, getting an
Oh
invitation
yeah.
from a friend, even, right? And having to say no to it. I just said yes all the time. Now, it sounded great and maybe it looked great from the outside, but then my family suffered. Or my wife was like, hey, listen, you've been gone too much. Like, we need you here. I know that your friend invited you, but you're going to be gone for 4 days and,
Yeah.
I need you here. And you were gone the previous week and the previous week, right? So at some point, I went too far and I realized that I had to create these boundaries. I learned how to say no to a lot of things. I think this is something dentists have a hard time doing. Saying no to patients is so important. I mean, I used to think I had to take every patient that came in. I was going to help everybody. And, it came from an ego thing, right? That I'm going to help them. No, the last 4 dentists that helped them that couldn't do it, they were just dumb. I'm the one
Right.
that's going to be able to help them. And of course, that got me into a lot of trouble, right? Because it wasn't the previous 4 dentists' problem. It was the patient's problem. So learning how to say no was a big, big step for me. And to be honest, I still struggle with it today, but I'm much
Yeah.
better
I
than
mean,
I
I love
was.
everything you're saying. And I think, we could go on and on, I think, for hours. And we try to, maintain a semblance of time management here. But I want to ask you on two ends of the spectrum. If you could impart one piece of advice to new and upcoming dentists, and one for really seasoned, high functioning, high achievers who might be dealing with some of what we're talking about. If there was a piece of advice you could give on both sides of the spectrum, is it the same? What would it look like? If there was something you could kind of leave our listeners with, and then before we wrap up today, I want to make sure people know how to reach you, what you're working on. I want to hear what you have going on. So I know that's a lot at once, but how about advice first?
Sounds good. Yeah, my advice would be the same for the new docs or the very seasoned, maybe even finishing their profession doctors that are now getting into the investing world or do something else, is separate your purpose in life from your
Mm,
profession. What we do in dentistry is not what you were put on the earth to do. That is your profession. That's how you make money. You can be passionate about it. You can love it. You can want to learn more and more and more, but it doesn't define who you are. This is not what your grandchildren will remember you for. They're not going to say, grandma or grandpa did the most amazing preps. No, they're going to remember how you made them feel. They're going to remember that you took them to Chuck E. Cheese on their birthday, or that you showed up to their soccer games, or that you were a great husband or mother, or that's what they're going to remember. And that was a big change for me, was separating my
I'm
purpose in
so
life from
touched
my
and moved by
profession.
that. That's
That
awesome. It's a really awesome piece of advice. I hope everybody takes that and runs with it. I want to kind of write that down and put it in front of me now. So that's awesome. Thank you for that. So, what are
yeah.
you working on? What's next? What do you have going on? Where can people find you? Are you doing retreats? Like, what is going on? Because I see speaker and like 1,000 titles for you. Like, how can people be around you and have your presence and all that good stuff?
Yeah, thanks. So I am still doing a lot. I mean, the easiest way to find me is my Instagram. It's just Dr. Kyle Stanley, Dr. Kyle Stanley. My website, drkylestanley.com. I have podcasts. I have one called Wellness and Dentistry. I have one that I do with Christian Coachman, also called The Happy Dentist. So I am all around. I mean, a big part of what I'm doing now that a lot of people don't see is the advising, investment, the consulting for dentists, because I've been in the tech world for, maybe 8 years, and grew Pearl to be fairly large, through some part is me, some part is other people. But I've gotten more involved with funding. So I would say if there's any dentists that are interested in investing in tech startups, I am creating certain areas, certain ways to make it easy for them to get into this idea of investing. And that's through some of my advisory roles with different dental funds that are out there.
That's
So yeah,
yeah, so
that's
that's
that's what I'm doing
amazing.
now.
You're definitely somebody worth following because you've already shown your mastery in that respect. So I appreciate you sharing that, and I hope that people will look you up at Dr. Kyle Stanley on Instagram, and then everything else branches out from there, and they can find you and follow you. I just so appreciate you being on the show. For our listeners out there, if I believe this is going to actually come out before ADI 2024, which is a conference happening. I think you were invited to speak at that too, and probably couldn't make it out. So
Yes.
for what it's worth, it's their
Yeah.
loss, and unfortunately, but we got you on the podcast, which is fabulous. But that's happening in, I think, December 6th and 7th. So people can get their tickets at adi2024.com. I can be found on Instagram at Spelling It. It's just like it sounds, Spelling It. And Dr. Cal Stanley, I'm so grateful for you being here. I'm sorry we lost Michael Keeter. I know he's here. He may be able to hear us, but we can't hear him or see him at the moment.
That's okay. I spent a lot of time with Michael. I didn't need any more
All
time with
right.
him today.
So thank you for being here. I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much.